Good afternoon. How are you, Ellie? Good. Good to see you. Thanks. Been a busy week. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. How's business? Good. That that seems like it'd be a nice. You meet a lot of. Right. It's. I was gonna say, hopefully you meet some nice people who are your guests. Oh, that's a. No problem. Good to see you, Cindy. Good
Just listen to a podcast
afternoon. Let's see. Agenda's 3:15.
Yep. The regular work session of the Annapolis City Council for Thursday, March 15th, 2018 will be called to order at 3:10. At this time, would everyone willing and able please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. City Attorney, please read the first item on the agenda.
The first item on the agenda is presentations, beginning with ID-66-18, Classification and Compensation Survey Report.
Okay, would Mr. Perkle and Mr. Bruchel, consultants representing Evergreen Solutions, please come forward.
Hi, I'm Tricia Hopkins. I'm Human Resources Manager. With me here today is Nancy Berkeley.
Make sure the mics are on.
Tricia Hopkins, Human Resources Manager. With me today is Nancy Berkeley from Evergreen Solutions, who is our classification and compensation consultant for the City of Annapolis Classification and Compensation Study. She's here to present the report you have before you and to answer any questions relative to the information presented.
Great. Hello, I'm Nancy Berkeley with Evergreen Solutions. Evergreen Solutions, just as a matter of point, we're based out of Tallahassee, Florida, so a national consulting firm. Happy to be here presenting the results to Mayor Council, and we'll go through this presentation. The agenda for today, I'm going to talk briefly about the process that we utilized in the study. A few comments about what we conducted, which is called employee outreach. That's a part of the study process. Review current conditions, the classification review results. This is what I call it a full classification compensation study, so we looked at both. Give you the high level in this presentation of the compensation results, or the results of the salary survey that we conducted. Our recommendations for a revised pay plan and implementation option, and then additional recommendations. So, looking at the study process, what we have, this is completed to date, is to conduct again what we call employee outreach. Just briefly, employee outreach was an opportunity for consultants from Evergreen Solutions to be here with the employees, with senior leaders, to describe what the study was about and ask for their employees for their individual participation in something we call a job assessment tool. And that process gathered information on every classification directly from the employees about the work that was being done. It also gives us input to something I'll mention in a minute here about internal equity, which is how we develop a compensable factor score. So we do use a point factor system for internal equity. So that input did give us those results. I should mention that after the employees input their information into a JAT, which is effectively like a job description, blank job description, telling us the work that they're doing, so we would make sure we were comparing apples to apples, if you will, when we're conducting salary survey or make any adjustments as necessary. That the supervisors also reviewed that input. So, additionally, with employee outreach, we had what we call focus group sessions, where we asked some questions with regard to compensation classification. So I have a few highlights of that in here. Analysis of current conditions. Again, I'll go through that, just briefly looking at the pay plan and some key points with that. Did review from the perspective of the city your compensation philosophy. Primarily, again, that's really the element of where do you want to be in the market. Key element factors, where do you want to be in the market. So when we're collecting the salary data, comparing the salary data, and then providing recommendations, it revolves around that position, of course. Again, the internal equity analysis is what I was mentioning before. We did conduct that by reviewing all of the JAT input and the supervisor review. And that gave us both that compensable factor scoring and any recommendations we might have for any class structure, really titling concerns or issues there. And I'll talk briefly about those results. External equity, we conducted a salary survey of the market to determine the competitiveness of your salary ranges to the salary ranges of what we worked with you to determine were your peers. We then developed a slightly revised is probably really how I would say it, step plan to remain competitive with the market. We'll get into the details of that here in a minute. And then developed an appropriate method going along with that of how to implement that revised structure, always with our recommendations of a new or revised structure would be how to do something with those recommendations through the employee salaries, how it would affect those. Annualize the cost for implementing that new structure or revised structure, and then prepare the draft report, which I believe you have copies of. What is remaining is to revise and provide the city with all of the classification /job descriptions and go through that process. We did already review FLSA. It'll give us another opportunity to look at that too, because what's identified in the job descriptions are the FLSA status, as well as we make sure that they're EEO, ADA compliant with different areas in the job descriptions. For example, what physical abilities are required for the job, for the essential functions, etc. We're still going to do some additional work, is what I'd really call it, with reviewing internal career ladders and make any additional recommendations we might have there with keeping positions competitive. It really has to do with positions where there's levels or where there should be an additional level. We've done that primarily with what we did with the internal review, but when we go through that job description review process, that might indicate just another opportunity for us to see something there, if we do, that says, okay, maybe we should consider something different here, because those would probably delineate if we had some area where there was a particular gap or something of that nature. We'll also give you final versions of the classification descriptions in electronic format after the approval of the Civil Service Board and HR. And also we have within our scope of our contract and appeals process, employee appeals process. So we'll provide those forms, that process by which employees can appeal a classification or a pay grade, one of the things possibly that we have recommended here in the study. We'll also look at the, continuing on with what's remaining, also look at what the role of the Civil Service Board in the classification compensation process, conduct training in that area to make sure there's a complete understanding of our recommendations. Additionally, train the appropriate human resources staff in the specific methods we utilized in job evaluation, again with that point factor scoring and the market data and how we assess the two. And then to ultimately give you a final report as well. Employee outreach that I mentioned before, these are just some very high-level key themes that came out of that outreach. One is that you have a very well understood, from the employee standpoint, pay plan, pay structure, and method of salary progression. So that's a positive thing. That's not always the case sometimes when we do these studies. So there were some concerns from some longer tenured employees that their salaries may reach maximums, or is typically referred to as sort of topped out, more than they would like, or more than they would expect at the point in their career. And some employees believe that they might have some other opportunities of advancement if there were some additional type of career ladders. I don't mind.
Alderman Annette?
Thank you. So on that point, some analysis that we actually were talking about in the Finance Committee yesterday, the way our system is set up with the steps, the positions are basically accelerated at the front end. So wherever their starting rate is, they basically get to their highest level of earning very quickly, certainly within, for many of the classifications, 15 years, and then they never get anything else. Are there other models that we could consider for that? Because I've only had a chance to breeze through this, but I didn't see alternatives that we could consider. Obviously, those would need to be debated with the employee representatives, but I didn't see in here discussion. It was noted what the size of the step increases is, but I didn't see analysis of what if we had smaller steps but more of them, or what if we had cost of living adjustments as opposed to steps. How do steps relate to career ladders? I mean, I think there's a lot of depth that I was looking for that I know this is just a preliminary report, but I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we need to be thinking about when we're looking at the budget, since obviously employee compensation's by far the biggest chunk. So I hope we're going to at some point get some alternatives that we can be noodling around, and certainly that the administration can be negotiating with the employee representatives.
Yeah, absolutely. To your point, we did look at multiple different and modeled some different plans, different methods, multiple. This is ultimately what we are presenting at the moment because of some of the things you just mentioned too, that you would, for collective bargaining, et cetera, possibly consider those. But absolutely did we look at some of those other alternatives in here. At this point, this is what we're recommending at this moment.
Will you be supplying us with the analysis of the alternatives?
You do have that information by way of some of the, you will have that information by some of the materials that we provide.
Supplementary to this?
Yes, to the report, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, current conditions. So, again, this really just states somewhat the obvious, but what your current plan is, or the plans for civil service, fire, and police, being how many grades, the steps, and the increments, and the range spreads. Might add just a moment on the range spreads from 60 to 78. Those are certainly appropriate from a total range standpoint. Anywhere from 50 to 70 is generally considered, if you will, best practice in a step plan. I'd say you can definitely go a little bit higher than that, as these are in 78% range spreads for fire and police. So definitely appropriate size. That's just something we look at, a range spreads. The next bullet there, if you will, is analyze the distribution of employees' salaries across the current pay ranges. And this is just a snapshot of the data saying that at the time of the study, you had 9.1% of employees' salaries in the first quartile, if you were to break up those ranges into quartiles, and 9.1% in the first quartile, 10.9 in the second, 32.8 third, and of course 47.2 in the fourth. Got a little note there that midpoint, just kind of hovering there between the second and third quartile at the 50th percentile. At midpoint is considered within compensation classification market, or where employees' salaries, employees would expect generally to have their salaries if they're performing proficiently and satisfactorily. So during a course of a career, if I start off with minimal qualifications and progress through, as an employee, generally speaking, and from a comp and class, how structures are designed, would be to have them hopefully be able to progress their salaries at least to the midpoint, and perhaps beyond the midpoint as well, but midpoint being at least market for somebody performing that work proficiently and satisfactorily.
Savage?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I have a question about the first bullet. So I see looks like 5.3% increment between steps, I assume. What's is there an industry standard for government to have, or best practice? Is that high or is it low compared to others? Do you have that information?
It's probably a little on the high side, but not necessarily for the area. So each time we have to look at area and region, which we did some work in looking at that, and looking at some, speaking of the other alternatives, looking at some alternative pay plans, different methods of progression. You can change it from more at the beginning, less at the end, constant throughout. There are various methods of doing, generally speaking, to try to mirror or have it be consistent with what you're trying to achieve, really.
Yeah.
Again, kind of going back, I should say, to that compensation philosophy. If you're having some challenges with recruiting, retaining individuals, again, you want to retain your longer term employees as well, so you've got to have considerations there. So it's somewhat of a balancing act, and trying to not be too different typically than your area and region either in doing so. I know that's a lot of but yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about the model where you offer more at the beginning and possibly less on the tail end. That's interesting idea.
There's more conversation now, continued conversation, I would say, in the studies that we do across the United States now again, with what is going to be appropriate, again, sometimes different for public safety than general employees, to attract and retain newer, certainly paying attention to the longer tenure too, so I don't want to exclude this by any means, but all of that taking into consideration is what do you want to try to do, because really the design and is all ultimately, again, to reward, of course, as best you can fiscally, the employees that are performing well and have stayed with you, and again, to try to attract and retain employees.
Thank you.
Alderman Annette?
Mr. Mayor, in looking at these quartiles, it seems extremely skewed. I would normally think that a bell-shaped curve would be what you would be looking for, and again, we've only just gotten this, so we didn't get a chance to digest all of this, but if we're going to have such an abnormal distribution, shouldn't there be a discussion about why and what the desirability is of that sort of a distribution?
Again, great observation. Really the distribution should, if you want to use that term, what should the distribution look like? Should reflect your philosophy. So, A bell-shaped, I would expect typically a bell-shaped curve of distribution across the 4 quartiles, more typically in a absolutely performance-based structure. Okay?
As opposed to what?
As opposed to one that's more tenure-based. Which yours is more of a tenure-based structure, philosophy.
That's quite a statement, tenure-based as opposed to performance-based.
Well, not as opposed, okay, let me clarify. I don't want to say, I'm making extremes, okay? Performance only, not tenure. Let me be clear, okay? I don't want to say without performance. Performance only based systems, which some areas are going to, not as much in this area, not as much in this region, you would expect to have a bell-shaped curve. Yes, that would be what you would expect to have over time, maybe not immediately, but over time. Performance only. Okay? This is representative of more, typically, of what I believe your philosophy has been over time. Not to exclude performance, I didn't mean to do that at all, but that it's continuing to give increases over time. Whereas in a strictly performance-based structure, there's a philosophy that you may not continue to give as many or the same amount of increases over time once you get past the midpoint.
So that leads to the next, which seems to come out through all of this report. I'd like to know who determined that philosophy, but I thought part of this analysis would let us come to an understanding of whether we do have the right philosophy. And again, I don't see anything that helps us think about that. I kind of like the word performance a lot more than I like the word tenure. But I could be wrong and could need some education. And those are the very kinds of policy things that we have to dig into, and in particularly when it comes to budget time. So, again, I would certainly value a lot more elaboration along those lines. There were some statements earlier about what our goals were, which I can't put my hand on it right now, but I didn't feel were my goals. So I'm trying to figure out whose goals they were. Again, I would like to see a study that questions all of these presumptions and gives us ways to evaluate whether we're making the right assumptions or we have the right mores or whatever you want to call it in terms of our philosophy for classification and compensation. But I'm going to have to think about that bell-shaped or not curve.
Again, if I may say, you can have a performance-based step plan structure too. So again, anything is possible. Yes, very variable increases, still performance-based. I have seen sometimes very small incremental steps, and based on performance, this isn't very typical, okay, but nonetheless, based on performance, somebody gets 1 step or 2 steps, if you will. Again, still varying, if you will, in the same manner in which typical open range plans do the percentage based on performance. We did have what I believe was some discussion of compensation philosophy. This is what we understood your philosophy to be.
Right.
And again, nothing wrong with that, and definitely more aligned with the philosophy in this area.
If we went to a career ladder system, would we expect that system to yield a more bell-shaped curve? One of the things that was noted here is the few number of people in the first quartile are usually either new hires or people who have newly come into that job. If you had a career ladder where people are moving up on the basis of merit rather than tenure, would that pull this bell-shaped curve back to a more normal distribution?
I wouldn't I wouldn't associate career ladder with a bell-shaped curve. I wouldn't use those two. Career ladder is more should, or would typically, in the way it is opportunities for movement, you know, through a career based
Right.
on ability, skill, what have you. So it doesn't really, it shouldn't change, if you will, that, I'm not sure.
The career
correlation you're
ladder,
making.
the career ladder I'm familiar with is the federal government.
Okay.
And basically, you had KSAs and then levels of responsibility. And it was up to you how quickly you demonstrated the next level of responsibility. The faster you did that, the more likely you were to get promoted, which comes obviously with more pay. So people don't tend to stay in the same position as long. A lot of people don't. Some do. Some people never move up. But a lot of people progress through the career ladder and they don't stay as long at any one step in the ladder.
I'm not certain that what you see here is really saying that, if that
Okay.
makes sense.
All right.
I wouldn't make that assumption.
Okay. Thank you.
Alderwoman Finlayson?
Do we not have employees in the police and fire departments who are in civil service?
In what?
So what I'm looking at, under the first bullet,
Yep.
civil service plan, that is inclusive of those in the police and fire departments who are in civil service. And then the next bullet is the fire plan. Is that inclusive again of those same employees, or those are everybody else in the department, in both police and
Right,
fire?
those are not the civil service.
Okay. I'm surprised that the increments are the same, and maybe I should know this better. How did those increments occur? How did we get to 5.3% for each increment?
From what I hear, because I wasn't here for to experience it firsthand, the historical information I've got is that it was a recommendation under a prior study to take the range width, and it was a combination of influence from collective bargaining as well as, again, information going into the consultant's work to create that scale. That odd percentage on the other side of 5, I can't even describe to you how it got there, other than perhaps it was just the range width was established, number of steps were determined, and then you divide it out, and that's how you get it.
Okay, so the previous study helped us move
Previous
there.
work,
and
yeah.
I think I heard you say some of that came through bargaining.
Some of that was influenced, absolutely, from what I understand, through discussions in our collective bargaining sessions with our fire department, who provided me some of that background, that they were strongly encouraging, substantial merit sizes for recruitment, retention, through the collective bargaining desires.
So I guess we can deduct that the effort that came through bargaining was through the traditional give and take over a period of time. So it wasn't through one bargaining session probably, but through several years of...
Yeah, again, I'm
Yeah,
going to give
I
that
know,
as
I'm gonna make
third-hand
that-
information.
I'm going to make
but-
that assumption.
Yeah, okay.
The fourth quartile, does that in any way equate to the years of service that an employee has in the city?
I don't have that information in front of me, but so I would only be making an assumption, but I would say that yes, it probably does because of how your system is designed.
Right.
But yes.
Okay.
The truth is, it's always
Um,
going to be a combination.
Yeah.
It's going to be not as, if you made the assumption everybody started at step 1, then you say, oh, we get there after somebody's been here and advance through the scale at least halfway. But that's not how that happens. People negotiate starting pay that may put them above the minimum. And so that the outcome of those negotiations are the methods in which you bring people on. We're very fortunate in this city in that we're we've been able to attract people with considerable backgrounds, and so you're gonna negotiate above step one in an effort to bring that kind of maturity or skill level that you need, so that, again, you don't have to kind of nurture them and grow them and ultimately turn them over when you want to stay kind of lean and capable. That's what happens in your recruitment process. So I would say it's a combination. It's a combination of what we've brought in on the entry level, like your entry level public safety, some other positions we've been able to do entry level successfully, and then obviously negotiating pay within the range is getting us there.
And thank you for reiterating that fact, because I think that's important for us to be aware of. Everybody doesn't come in on step one, begin with a starting salary. We bring them in, especially laterals, so that we can keep them whole, if not improve upon their salaries.
Well, and some of it is, you look at what are the minimum qualifications for a job and say, well, this person far exceeds the minimums that I'm looking for in this particular position. Therefore, we're going to figure out how to pay them appropriately for what they're bringing to us. And we do that. And I would say that with what you mentioned about bringing in laterals, we are saving ourselves training expenses when it comes to entry-level positions in public safety when we do so. And then a lot of times those individuals are already bringing post-academy experience, already out in the field experience, and therefore there's very little investment of time and effort in bringing them into the city of Annapolis's way of comporting themselves, and therefore the decisions that are made by the police chief or the fire chief are consistent with that. But they've been very good about being consistent on what they compensate that talent, at what level they compensate that talent, I should say.
Well, and you're making an excellent point that we need to be aware of, because there is a cost savings when we bring in laterals who are already trained, who already come with a high level of experience. So we're not starting them. I mean, we're saving, what, $50,000, $100,000 in police and fire, because we don't have to train them and lose them for a year, maybe, to get them into a place where they can step into a position.
Yeah, you're clearly looking at academy time that for a police officer is 6 months. Then you have field training, and then then they're always partnered up before they're left to operate that vehicle by themselves and respond to calls and other responsibilities. So yeah, it is.
When I saw the chart, the 47 percentile to me said we also need to be looking at new hires. I mean, if these are the bulk of our folks are on the high end, at some point down the road, maybe not too far down the road, we're going to lose a lot of employees because they have given their years of service as well as, received their highest salaries. They're going to be retiring.
Yeah, I think I figured out back in the IBB days that when I had time to actually figure stuff out.
During IBB you had time?
Well, because Paul Renstead was here. But anyway, at the time I figured out that the average city employment time was 12 years. So
Okay.
you have that factor as well. You're looking at the longevity associated with working for the city. We have people that come and stay, and so clearly at some point they're going to be able to mature to the point of retirement, and you want that. You want to keep your talent. It's not that it's strictly a business decision. It's your community building, it's your service level, it's all of those things that come into play when you're keeping your employee population to carry out the work of the city.
And this is my last question, so you can move on with your presentation. At some point then, maybe we need to be thinking about what we do on the back end to help retain some of our seasoned employees that are ready to leave.
You mean stay longer and not retire?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my experience in the school system, we had to do that. We had to add a few more extra steps after 30 so that we would be sure to keep the experience that we needed in the classroom.
And we've done that with police and fire in the most recent negotiations. As you know, we've added steps to fire, and we've added steps to police. There's another step 12 coming for police effective July 1st. So yes, we are, and AFSCME has negotiated an additional 20-year step effective July 1st. So yeah, we know that, and we've tried to be very cognizant of that in collective bargaining. It's money. We have to afford it, and you know, all of that is important in making all of those decisions.
And it's
a lot to weigh.
It's a subject that management needs to be cognizant of and concerned about.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Alderwoman Tierney?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Very briefly, and thank you very much. I understand this is a draft, and I just wanted, as a point of discussion, what we just talked about in the last couple of minutes as far as retainage and early retirement, et cetera, that justifies why this cannot be a bell curve, basically. There are exterior variables that influence this. Am I correct as far as not early retirement, but holding on until retirement benefits kick in? And the, you know, wanting to retain the employee, wouldn't those be the variables to keep this sort of skew versus a bell curve?
Again, the best way I could say this is the distribution of employee salaries based on all of the comments are all still reflective, or should, or would typically be reflective of what I would say is where should salaries be? And my answer is normally salary should be where what your compensation philosophy is, taking into consideration what you just said, what you just said, what Tricia just said about pay practices, you know, variable pay practice, which is a good thing. Thank you for bringing that up again too, that you bring people into different things. And then it's, does this mirror that philosophy? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it would only be a bell curve if
it
that's
does.
what you want it to be, because you have that type of philosophy.
So it's driven by philosophy. And second part of my question is, do you address retainage in your report? Our retainage, how are we doing on retaining employees is my question.
Not specifically, no, we do not. I apologize. No. I mean, we discussed it as, are there areas as a conversation of, should we do something different, going back again to modeling different types of plans and et cetera, for those issues? Because again, that goes to philosophy and what are you trying to accomplish? And you're right, there's a balance, there's a lot of different factors. There's the pay practices, I'm pointing that you need to, I apologize, on what you brought up as well too, of, well, you're bringing people in, all of those things taken into consideration. So it should be what you want it to be, is the best way I could say that from a philosophy standpoint.
Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just my last comment on this section. Thank you. I think what you said about the philosophy is important. I think that's something we'll have to figure out at what direction as a city we may want to go. Because I do share my colleagues' desire to kind of equal out, have more of a bell curve, traditional bell curve. And it sounds like that variable increase method may be one way to get there. Because ideally, I'd almost rather see, if we allocate X amount of money, I'd rather see that distributed in a more equitable manner, in the sense that more of that money would go towards the lower percentile, the lower end of the salary scale, as opposed to that going towards the higher. Because if the higher are getting a fixed percentage increase, that's going to be a lot of money compared to those on the bottom. And short term, that may not equal it out, but I think long term, it seems like it may help create more of a bell curve, and also potentially make a lot more fiscal, financial sense on the city's part. I'm not sure if that's even doable under our current model, but thank you. This is very thought-provoking.
Alderwoman Pindell Charles?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I guess piggybacking on what Alderman Savage has said, just from a practical standpoint, it can kind of work both ways. When when you have more of a salary increase at the beginning, those are usually people who have children, are married, have a mortgage, and all those kinds of things. And once you get a little bit older, hopefully it's lessened a bit. But then on the flip side of that, you have the older ones who have more institutional knowledge versus the newer ones that come in are just learning. So I guess it's just kind of a balancing effect.
Alderman Henson, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Looking at the salary quartile analysis, it looks like we have, and forgive me if I'm jumping ahead, like we have clusters of grades that are populated and then some that are lesser. When we look at does the A, is that for administrative, or what does that represent? I get that the F is fire and the P is police, the
And
A
A
is
is everybody else.
everybody else. When we look at everybody else, in A7, we have a large cluster, and then when we look at those defined, what positions those are lots of things that are level 1 or level 2. And then we look at the next one, A8, and then it's a large drop-off, and those are things that are level 2 or 3. It would seem like the natural progression where if you were promoted and you were in that position in a step 1 or 2, then you would then be in a step 2 or 3, depending on where you started at on the next level. And
Alderwoman, where are you?
I'm on page, it says 3-8, 8,
3A,
on page 8,
Okay.
3-8.
3-8, thank you, Alderman Arnett. It would look like we are not, did you notice any trends, or what do those numbers speak to when they're large clusters, and then sometimes it doesn't seem to follow a trajectory?
I wouldn't draw too many conclusions from the data as it is right now. It literally is pretty much just saying the data. Because we have to look at, again, I know you're saying that, but we have to look at the classes that are in there, and again, all those variables which you mentioned, did we just have new hires in there? What's causing that?
Okay, so did we, I don't know if we dive that deep into the data in this report. Does it give is there any place else I can look to get a better understanding of what fluctuates the numbers there from classification to classification?
Not in this report. It's
Okay.
something certainly we could look at. I'm not certain.
Well, clearly you've got at P10, P11, those are your entry-level positions in police. At F10 and F11, those are your entry-level positions in fire. It shows that a lot of people have moved to 12 because of their certifications that they've received. And so, again, those bubbles or clusters are more about, you're always going to have your lower ranking staff, and as you move up the chain and you get into officer ranks in the public safety units, you're going to have lesser numbers of positions because they're management. And so that's easily defined. When you're talking about positions on the A scale, you're going to have in like a 7, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those tend to be your non-management positions for sure. Those are individuals that don't have supervisory authority or any higher level skills, that maybe they're not in the highest levels of a series for, say, fleet maintenance or the like, so that, again, your non-management, non-leader staff is going to be where more of your positions are. And then your professionals are going to be in your 12s or your 15, and they may not have management experience, but they have policy, or they have higher level skills that they need to be credentialed. Maybe they need bachelor's degrees in order to hold those positions.
Just looking at it with just without the benefit of a deeper dive, it looks like we have in the positions where there are the steps 1, 2, or 3, that there's a concentration in the step 1 or 2. That I don't know that this is showing that we have the opportunity for growth, and that we have an even distribution amongst the different steps in a position that's the same. If it's an associate or an assistant, sometimes there's the 1, 2, 3 that's after that, and it looks like we're concentrating in the 1s or 2s, not dipping into the 3s or the other promotion levels at the same rate. I think the fire department probably has the best span, where it's lesser on the entry level end, lesser on the senior management end, and then kind of a broad range in the middle, whereas some of the other ones, there appears to be heavy loaded here, not so much there, not so much there. So I was just wondering if there was a way to better understand that, but it sounds like it's a lot of variables, and sometimes it's one thing and sometimes another. Thank you.
Alderman Annette?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a fundamental question. I'm looking at the number of employees here, 554, which seems much lower than numbers we see in budget documents. Is this only full-time permanent employees? So there's no seasonal or part-time?
Correct.
All right.
Yeah, because they do not have job descriptions, they're not on the A scale, they're not on any scale specifically.
They're not civil servants, right?
They're not civil service, they're not in the
Okay.
exempt service that are, identified in the code specifically, who are also on the A scale. Contractual employees aren't amongst this group, because again, they are paid according to their contractual agreement. So this is truly those individuals that have a great assignment. And,
We continue? Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Again, great discussion. I would encourage you, again, all of the variables. It goes to, again, what are you trying to reward and send? And I think everybody's made some very appropriate comments here, with even the design of the plan, because again, it's the best plans or the most well-balanced compensation structures, where there's ability for employees to progress their salaries through a range, whether it's step, open, what have you, through a range as they would hope to expect, again, going back to my comment about it, the market, what have you, if they're performing. Maybe make a choice, do I want to stay in that position for a long time, or do I want to move up in a career ladder, management, whatever the type of position are, so that it's and I mentioned 50 to 70% spreads or what have you, a balance of, if you will, from minimum to maximum progression through salary ranges, as well as progression as opportunities arise, certainly, to move up. And there are people who will want to stay in one position for some time, perhaps, and there are people who will progress up. It's a balance. If you get the structure too tall, I'll call it, with opportunities for promotion, or I shouldn't say too tall, but it's not just about that, because there should be progression to the right as well, as we see some in the quartile distribution here. So it's again, what are you trying to, it's many factors involved, and then having the appropriate plan and incentives, pay practices, whatever, to reward that. Classification. Just briefly on classification, we did review all of of course, the JET input. We calculated what we call JET scores, or really compensable factor scores, based on the compensable factors such as decision-making, complexity, et cetera, of the job. And then we made some title change recommendations, which are reported in the report. These are not what I would call, you didn't have a significant amount of, I call, class work to do, where, oh gosh, we should make some different things here, try to consolidate, try to do this or try to do that. You had what I would call a pretty good, well-defined classification structure from a job titling standpoint. So the recommendations that we made are not such that I would say it's an overhaul of your entire class system by any means. They're typical what we see kind of in the time of when we do these studies. Can call some things something different than what they were typically called, a titling nomenclature, if you will. Okay, just as a point. Okay, from compensation then. So we did create, again, a salary survey document and collected data from these 9 peers, which were approved, if you will, or considered, as peers, I should probably say, by the city as well, as your peers. we collected data at the salary range data and compared it to your salary range data to see where the structure is currently in the market.
Alderman Annette?
Two questions or three on that. What was the selection universe for the peers? I noticed on page 2.3, the peers that the employees indicated doesn't really overlap very much with the peers that were selected for the comparison. And that raises the question, what was the selection criteria? How do we decide 9? How do we decide these 9?
Okay, well, first of all, to one point of what the what the employees typically provide is considered when we make our recommendations for the determination of who the peers are. So it's who they said. Again, as you can see, many they do overlap. It is an idea of when we're conducting the focus group to say employees, it's effectively like saying where do you think employees are going potentially, to competitors. We, in looking at peers, typically, I'll say start from a starting point, we're going to say your peers are typically those organizations from which you're competing, literally from a geographic standpoint, that employees could come or go to that are more similar to you in nature, but are going to typically have those same types of positions that you have available that we can survey. So a determination was made that these would be the appropriate peers. I mean, to ask a specific one, I don't know if that's what you're asking, but.
Well, I guess the question is, you could pick 9, presumably Anne Arundel County would be one we would definitely want to see as a comparison, probably Bowie, but Frederick, Gaithersburg, Rockville, I mean, I think some of the ones the employees talked about seem more relevant. Howard County certainly has got to be one of the highest paid, county to put in there. Alexandria, Virginia, the same. So I guess it would be interesting to see who could we have chosen and how do these compare out of the universe of comparators that we could have selected.
Well, some of what you have is available data, meaning that they're going to provide you the information.
Okay.
And the other part of it is when you're dealing with police and fire service is a pretty significant part of your study base, and you're picking jurisdictions that don't have one or the other or both.
Certainly.
It
yeah.
really starts limiting what you have for comparators, and you want to make sure that you've got a good survey grouping here that's going to give you the information you need to study.
Did any of the comparators here have a 7.5-hour workday for some of their employees? And if they don't, did we make an adjustment for that?
I don't know, did you?
No.
Ask for hours of work?
We do ask for hours of work, but we did not make an adjustment, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure we were made aware to make an adjustment for what I'm asking.
Overstate by 12.5%?
37.5.
Ours should
We
be
are
reduced
35 hours
by
for some
12.5% to be
positions.
comparable to
For
that.
all, for some positions?
For some,
If they're working 8
for
hours and we're working
office
7.5.
positions, basically.
Yes.
That's
We can look
hourly
at that
rate.
to see if that would make we can certainly look at that, because we probably have that data.
Good.
We can certainly make that, we can do that.
Thanks. Public safety, of course, works 40,
Yes.
42 or
Yes.
a lot more.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
And we adjusted any data for cost of living too, that's mentioned in here. So, again, to the point Tricia made too, we're trying to collect enough data so that we get the number of responses to provide valid data for the benchmark position, so. And there's certainly always, when I look at the data, there's always ones that are paying higher, ones that are paying lower. But we also, I would mention, we don't just copy data over and put it into the salary survey results. Like, for example, if we saw not a good match or something like that, we wouldn't actually enter the data. You know, there's a lot of work that has to go into actually looking at what you're receiving from individuals and determining whether, if I saw something that was differential of 50%, I would say they probably didn't give us a good match, because you just don't see that. It's atypical.
Alderman Finlayson?
Yeah, I would just warn us to not include things that are subject to bargaining. You know, and if work hours were the subject of bargaining, then we shouldn't consider it unless we're going to do the same thing. They got to that point by give and take on both sides. So if their work hours are 35 hours or 35 and a half or 40, whatever, if it came about by subject to bargaining, then we don't want to include it because we're not dealing with apples and apples. So, thank you.
Okay.
Please continue. Yeah.
Okay, so we get to this slide, which is a high-level view of information that you do have in the report as well. But from overall, then, for the 56 benchmark positions, when comparing to the market position or average of the data collected, your range, again, this is the average of all of those benchmark positions. So the range structure was what we would say head of the market at the minimums by 2.7%, ahead at the midpoint by 1.6, and ahead at the maximum by 1%. So overall, one could say that your overall structure appears to be competitive at market.
Can you repeat that? The overall structure is, I'm sorry, Mayor.
Okay. You go ahead, and I'll add a question after you.
I just wanted her to repeat
Sure.
what she just said.
Just repeat that again, thank you.
So overall, your structure is competitive at a market position, because I see here that overall, for the benchmark classifications for the salary survey, you were ahead when comparing salary range data to their salary range data for each of those. 2.7% ahead at the minimum, 1.6 at the midpoint, and 1% at the maximum. Ahead of the competitive market position.
Okay. We don't have that chart. That's what I was kind of looking for. But I'm looking at 4.45. But, okay, I'll find it.
4-4 provides the detail
Yeah,
for each
but
of the
there's-
benchmark
okay.
positions.
Mr. City Attorney?
I had a question on page 5-2, where you have proposed classification changes at Exhibit 5A, and what is the thinking or significance or importance of the manner in which you determine current class title and recommended class title?
You jumped ahead.
Well, that kind of goes back to what I was saying on classification. So in reviewing of the JATs and that process, if we read something, a couple of things, we either determine from a JAT, maybe it should be called something different from a more typical titling standpoint, and or it could have been a suggestion through a process, which I hadn't mentioned, but is a management issues tool. A supervisor could complete something saying, I think it'd be better if we called these MIT positions, and we can drop that and just call them. I don't know that this is the case. I'm just providing this as an example. Could have suggested that, we would have gone, yes, that seems like a good idea. That's more typical. We'll make that change. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and I guess I had a specific interest in the first two items, where we had assistant city attorney and assistant city attorney, and it looks as if the recommended class title would be limiting the functionality of an attorney in number 1 and number 2, and where you have a small staff and multiple functions of attorneys. I was just wondering if that was a good idea. It might be a good idea under some circumstances, but not under other circumstances. So I just wanted to state that as and to find out if it was important to make sure that we didn't limit the functionality of certain positions in classifying them.
I would certainly say that that's an excellent observation, that you may or may not want to proceed with all of the recommendations here. The recommendations could have been made because it was suggested and thought that that was an appropriate recommendation. Again, kind of goes back to, do you want a more broad, do you have a staff, again, that you want to be able to utilize and not confine?
Right.
Sometimes, literally, it is a client preference.
Okay. I just want, yeah, and that's why I was,
Yes.
that's why I asked the question, because
Yeah.
it does depend, I think, on the amount of staff and the expertise of staff and multiple factors in determining how you might want to allocate a particular functionality and associate it with the position.
So I would not say that there's anything in here that I can see right now that I would say, oh, absolutely, it should be this way or
Gotcha.
that way.
Okay. Thank you. I was curious. Thanks.
Okay?
Let's continue.
Okay? Oh,
On
Hold
page
on a minute.
4.5, in the middle, there's a statement, the market midpoints are important to consider, as midpoint is commonly recognized as the salary point at which employees are typically fully proficient and satisfactorily performing. And it goes on. And that takes me back to our skewed distribution, where we're clearly well beyond the midpoint. And I don't know what we're supposed to do with a statement like this. Does that indicate that there's some action we should take if we find that most of our employees are well beyond the midpoint?
no. Again, I hate to keep bringing it back to the compensation philosophy, but again, it revolves around the compensation philosophy, because it certainly doesn't mean that employees wouldn't expect necessarily to have their salaries continue past a midpoint. Again, the extent to which they do should mirror or try to reflect, to the best of your ability, your philosophy. So if increases should or should not continue for people beyond that who are still performing, I would imagine, at least proficiently and satisfactorily, but it's a matter of a philosophy of, do you continue to, at what percent, if you will, or whatever, do you continue to give those increases and have people go higher in the range? From a pure compensation standpoint, once people are paid past that midpoint, generally speaking, they're getting paid more than most people are to do that same work. It's your decision, again, how you want to continue to do that. There's an effect, pros and cons of keeping, and rewarding what you're trying to reward and keep and retain and all of those things that we mentioned before. Okay, so I've moved on now to, so what we did, given, again, having looked at some other alternatives as well, as at this point in time came to the conclusion, if you will, that what we would recommend is this revised pay plan, which is effectively your same pay plan with these highlights here on the F-18 and F-20 positions from a minimum to maximum. And those are now mirroring the police P-18 and P-20, because that is, we believe, appropriate and reflective and common practice, et cetera, all of those things combined with market. We did make some pay grade recommendations, changes to some of the A grades. So when doing this, one can say, let's revise the whole structure and make pay grade assignments. Let's make some minor revisions to a structure, or let's just make some pay grade changes or recommendations, I should say, where we see some areas perhaps in the market and with that internal equity that it is appropriate to do so.
And you do your point factor system.
And we utilize the point factor system. So again, thank you. To bring to point the internal equity, it's not an absolute mirror of the market, if you will, because you could have something askew in your internal equity when you're doing that. So that's utilizing what I previously mentioned, that internal equity. So we literally looked at all the classifications and said, as if this were a new plan, if you will, and said, well, individually assign what should the grade be? Is that and in this case, we could see that we would make some recommendations for some pay grade changes. 20, I believe it was. So you don't see those in here because it's just showing the revised pay plan as a whole.
So,
On Annette?
Trish, will you be able to give us before and after comparisons? I mean, where are we now? And I'm interested, obviously, from the Finance Committee point of view, what does this do to our wage bill if we go to this new schedule?
That's been provided to the finance.
Pardon?
That's been provided to the finance department. Yeah,
Okay.
so it'd definitely be part of the budget process.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The chart that we have is somewhat different. Can you tell us what the headings are on those 4 columns? I know what the first one is.
Grade on this, grade, minimum, midpoint, and maximum?
Okay. So what we have is steps 1 through 12 on 5-4. I assume that's because you highlighted.
Because we're,
Yeah.
yes, because we're just showing only those points. I'm sorry, yes.
So let me be clear on this. The range is the range between 1 and 10 or 1 and 12.
Yes.
Okay. Why F, 17, 18, and 20? And you may have just said that, but I didn't understand. That's highlighted on this sheet, and I think it's highlighted on the screen also.
18 and 20 is hard. 18 and 20
Okay.
are highlighted because, okay, so let me step back again. So we made some recommendations for some grade changes, which you can't immediately see here what those were. Those were classification, changing the grade. And then the only other change would be to the design of from the minimum to the maximum. This way of looking at it would be to make F18 and F20 be like P18 and P20.
Alderwoman Finlayson, I think what you're seeing is that if you'll notice on their spreadsheet, every other line has a gradation. So it looks like 17, 18, and 20 are all doing something. And really, it's just the 18 and the 20.
Okay.
It's okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Well, and as you were talking, that's when I realized that every other one was really highlighted.
That's why it looks like they're in the
Okay.
same boat.
All right, that's okay.
I apologize.
That's okay. But those are the only 2 areas across the board that you felt there were some, okay,
Yes.
I'm good. Maybe you answered this, but is the range typical? Comparing
spread?
us? Yes, the range spread.
Yes.
So we're not out of
No.
alignment at all with
No.
that? Okay.
No.
Well, fire is.
I know you that was on one
And
of the
I'm
early
gonna-
charts.
Can I also mention, just as a point as well, on 4.4, if you look at 4.4 in the report, for example, another just data point that we always look at is with the column that says survey average range, it's really for all of the data that we collected, the range widths. Average to be 63%, so that's another thing we look at, not only in that best practice, but also from a peer standpoint. If you were in a market that was all 50% or something like that, sometimes that comes into play in the design and recommendations. So you're right in the appropriate
Ballpark. Okay,
place.
thank you.
Ms. Pickle, how many more slides do you have?
Just a few now, I think.
Okay, cool. Alderman Arnett,
Yes.
did you want to ask?
Oh, no, I'm
You good?
over here kibitzing.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we just have another one after you, so I'm just trying to squeeze them all
Move
both
ahead.
in. So thank you. Cheers.
Okay. So,
I'm going to give your cell number to Ross, and he's going to.
So on this here now, with costing out the change, if you will, or if you were to go forward with the changes in the grade recommendations that we made, and those few minor change we made to those two that we just talked about, the implementation cost annualized would be $114,000, because we would again take those individuals and those grade change ones and take them to the same step in that higher grade, and that results in total cost of 25 employees would receive adjustments. These are salary only, not benefits.
Will
Alderman Arnett?
will we get copies of your PowerPoint? And
The presentation.
let me understand, you're saying that we, when we're compared, we're ahead, but we're also recommending increasing even more? Why?
Some individual grades. So, is that what you're, so, when you look at so again, we individually, some positions were still lagging the market individually.
Right?
So this is really a minor adjustment to change those, not the whole structure. This is structure change. This is some individual grades that showed that they were behind or from both the internal and external equity standpoint.
Why would the adjustments be unidirectional? We only adjust where we're lagging, where we're ahead, we don't adjust down?
That's again a
A
determination.
philosophy.
That's a determination that a client can ask us to do, to make recommendations to adjust down. That is not a typical practice. The typical practice, and I would advise, is normally if a classification is ahead in the market, if you will, that you not necessarily again make changes, like we didn't make changes to some, but let the market catch up. You don't typically, from a standpoint of human resources compensation classification, reduce a salary range, typically. Doesn't mean you can't.
Alderman Savage?
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like there are a number of philosophical things we have to kind of decide, but just to get clarification, it sounds like this has already gone to finance department?
Well, they've been provided the information for budgeting purposes. That doesn't mean that we're not in a draft stage. It means that, as everybody is concerned, is that we are aware of implementation costs and planning accordingly.
So it's gone to them for some of that assessment, or is it actually being included in this year's budget?
It's in the union negotiations,
We-
right?
we-
It's in the negotiations.
Thank you, Alderman. Yes, we need to bargain any differences to the scale. If this were to be implemented, we also need, and left exactly as is and as recommended without any change, we also need to account for an implementation cost. And so we're being forthright in providing that information through our budget process, so that we're not, as everyone was concerned, not, left unaccounting for its impact. So yes, that's why we've done that.
Is it normal for this not to come to the council before it goes to negotiation?
Is it normal for this to come?
Because this is coming to us now for the first time, but it's already being used in negotiation, it sounds like.
These recommendations are not changes to the scale. These recommendations are the result of evaluation through the consultant's work of all of the classifications, the persons that filled out their job analysis questionnaires, the job descriptions that they have, and using their point factor system to determine if they were properly on grade. So any recommendations that are part of the 25 employees here have only to do with those individuals who occupy titles who through the study conducted here are recommending grade changes to, pay changes as a result of that. And under our rules and regulations under the personnel system, if an individual's reclassified and their position is regraded and to a higher grade, they are provided at least a 5% increase in pay. And typically what happens is that they need to be fitted on the higher step in the grade. There's 7.5% difference between grades. So typically that increase is around 7.5%.
And has this gone to the Civil Service Board?
It has not gone to the Civil Service Board yet.
It just seems like some of this might be more policy decision that we haven't really worked out yet.
Except that if you intend to implement it within the next budget year, again, it's kind of like a holding place.
Yeah.
So that you're not underfunded for something that's you're trying to move through your, I don't want to call it a bureaucracy, but through your processes that include the Civil Service Board.
Mr. Mayor, if I could answer this question, if I could, just so it's clear, this information was presented to the management like on Tuesday night. This is the first time the unions have seen this information.
Correct.
So it hasn't been discussed in negotiations at all. We just got it ourselves. And so.
Alderman Tierney?
Thank you,
We
Mr.
have
Mayor.
to move it along pretty, we've got half an
Yeah,
hour for the
real-
next one,
real-
so I don't want to have to get all John Grasso on you.
I know. Real quick. So those adjustments, for lack of a better word, is a salary adjustment for a position. Is it a monetary mathematical adjustment, or is it based on a career evaluation? Is there some subjectivity? Not that I don't want anyone to get a salary
No,
increase.
the rules and regulations, as I just stated, are, since we have a step system, there are defined pay rates associated with each step. If an individual changes a grade assignment, they don't remain in their same grade and the position is increased in grade, then they must receive at least a 5% increase in pay for that. And so when they're fit on the step in the higher grade, that is your cost. And so that's what the consultants have costed for us for that. It is. It is.
Depending on your philosophy.
It's not a competitive promotion, but if it had been, if that person was actually competing for a higher graded position, they would have received an increase in pay associated with that. So you could look at it another way, which is that the individual's been functioning in a position for a period of time where they haven't been properly paid based on now study information, and that you're writing that. You're not going back in time to fix it. You're not going back retroactively and providing it. You're going forward and providing it.
Okay, next slide.
Okay, so any additional recommendations are just that it's pretty typical. We would suggest you continuously, of course, review pay practices, review and align as necessary. Again, as I've mentioned before, be aligned with the philosophy, peers, etc. Review and revise job descriptions on a regular basis. Typically, that's done at some annual type of time, if possible. Administer and maintain the new plan or the revised plan. Really, that means to a certain degree of, like we just talked about, if there are some grade changes that perhaps need to be made. Again, we're going to train HR staff with the same job evaluation that we did. So I call it with some proper maintenance and administration, not that there hasn't been, but continued, if you will. You can make some of those individual changes if needed, provided all the things you need to go through to do those with the Civil Service Board, et cetera. But you can make those changes as needed as well. So we'll be giving the same training in that, even in the conducting of, you collect salary survey information, et cetera. And then overall, we typically recommend doing a comprehensive study every 3 to 5 years. I'd say 3 years is mostly for maybe what I would call a compensation update. Perhaps not necessarily needed would be the full, I call it classification, but maybe a compensation update. Data does age, market data does age, your structure may age over time, so sometimes it's a compensation update at a 3-year time and a full study at the 5-year time, just to kind of make sure everything's still in sync.
May I ask a question?
Mr. City Attorney?
Did I read the previous slide correctly that the cost to implement this would be $114,600 and whatever, that's $64, and it affects 25 employees? Is that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to nail down the cost of the recommendations. Thanks.
Yes.
Alderwoman Finlayson?
Thank you very much for this presentation. I just want to note for the record that the city manager is the director of HR. Ms. Hopkins is a manager because her position was demoted along with 2 others, if my memory serves me correctly. And so the new city manager will also have the responsibility of managing the HR department. And I hope all of you see the difficulty in that task alone. Ms. Hopkins does an outstanding job as the director without compensation or title, which is incomprehensible. But it is a decision that this body made, not collectively, but made. So just to make you aware, new people, new mayor, new city manager coming in, evaluate it. That's all I ask you to do. Thank you, Ms. Hopkins, for
Thank you.
the yeoman's
Alderman
job.
Arnett, last question.
Thank you. I'm having a hard time, are the 25 employees that we're talking about, these positions that are identified on pages 5.6, 5.7, 5.8, and 5.9? And if so, I get a lot more than 25 if we're counting all of this cluster at the end, fire lieutenant, fire captain, fire battalion chief, deputy chief, and so forth. I get 23 before I get to this cluster of, looks like 13 or 14, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
You don't, there isn't a place immediately in this report where you see those 25 and those 25, or those 20. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, it's a recommendation, it talks about 25 employees, and there's,
The report is a high level. Other information has been provided.
Well,
We'll get that for you.
when will we see that?
as soon as I have that conversation with the city manager.
We see that.
Patience, please.
Alderwoman Pindell-Charles,
Thank
second.
you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate your indulgence. Following up on the question of Alderwoman Finlayson, the Office of Environmental Policy Director salary was still in that same boat. But I noticed on here that it's being reduced down to manager. Is there a reason for that?
That position is no longer serving as a director of a department. It is an office, and the pay structure of this city is for the grade 20 for directors of departments. And so that position we had, again, it's as a result of looking at the job analysis, looking at internal equity, looking at the value of the position relative to the similarly situated positions in the city government, and that was determined through this analysis.
Okay, all right, I didn't know, thank you for the
You're
explanation.
welcome.
Thank you so much for the report. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. City Attorney, please present the next item on the agenda.
The next item on the agenda is ID 67-18, Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan.
All right, Pete has a
Give me
10-minute
a second.
10-minute presentation for us.
Smoke 'em if you got 'em.
Maybe we'll leave the questions till the last. Yep.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, City Council members, Pete Gutwell, Director of Planning and Zoning. Dr. Nash is with me, the Chief of Comprehensive Planning, and with us this afternoon is the Chair of our Historic Preservation Commission, Ms. Kennedy. Michael Dowling and Eileen Fogarty were also core planning members of this plan. What I'm going to talk to you today about is sort of a high level, and I promise I won't take that long, is the Cultural Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan. A long-awaited effort over a number of years that will also be an amendment to our hazard mitigation plan. I think Chief Simmons, another partner in all of this, presented to you his hazard mitigation plan. This is a piece that will amend that hazard mitigation plan to deal with the cultural resources of our historic district. I'm going to briefly kind of go over. There's been a lot of talk about sea level rise, flooding of the city dock, and the issues with protecting and preserving our historic district. I'm just going to kind of briefly go through. Obviously, sea level rise and all that, the change, climate change, are big aspects that we have to start planning for, and this is just a piece of what we have been doing in our planning efforts. Obviously, we've had a history of storm surges, impacts to our cultural resources over the years. Obviously, Isabel being one of those bigger ones that impact the historic district in our city dock area and our cultural resources. Obviously, this has been documented and talked about in other aspects of our built environment in city dock. Oops, sorry. I was just trying to get rid of that. Through the city dock master plan. And calling out for a cultural landscape survey to identify those things that are significant to us and contribute to the historic nature of our landscape of the city dock. And one of those considerations has been this issue of flooding of the area. FEMA has put out through their hazard mitigation planning efforts a consideration for your cultural resources and a step-by-step process in which you shall do that and how you conduct one of those things and implement sort of a cultural resource hazard mitigation plan. We will be one of the first, from my understanding, dealing with that cultural resource and mitigating and hazard mitigation planning, putting those two together. We did receive a grant, I think it was around about $100,000 to do this as part of our hazard mitigation planning efforts from MEMA through FEMA. So the cultural resource hazard mitigation plan itself. And we're calling it the CRIMP. I don't know why, just because we love to use acronyms for everything in planning. So the first part is the land market. The first chapter, I'm just going to sort of highlight what's in the document that you have and you've received and we've submitted as a draft plan to MEMA for their review, is the land market risk. That's just identifying the cultural resource. It's talking about the characteristics of the historic district. Then we talk about the hazard type. Obviously, there are different hazard types that Office of Emergency Management has to plan for: tornadoes, snow events, those kinds of things. This is focused on flooding, nuisance flooding, and sea level rise. And then the document goes through a lot of statistical analysis and a review of what's happened over the years, not just locally, but also regionally and nationally. Then, of course, there is considering the cultural resource itself and a process. The document goes into great lengths, I will say, in documenting the process and the steps and the phases of the way through over the past couple of years, actually starting all the way back to 2013, with planning for this type of issue and the city dock area and the cultural resource that we're trying to protect through this process. And then finally, this is where the area which I would focus your attention on. This is a large document with a lot of appendices and a lot of information that's in it. But I'll focus, I want you to, personally, I would look at you focusing on this chart that's in the back. This is the Stapley project. This is sort of where they analyzed each of the chapters that are identified in the document, but Stapley stands for the social, technical, administrative, political, legal, economic, and environmental impacts. And they gave it a rating, and they looked at what are the ability to be successful in each one of these categories of this recommendation of the policies, the goals, the objectives, and the actions that they've identified throughout this document.
But Pete,
It's
where can I find this in the report?
It's in it's in the appendice. It should be the first appendice. It looks like
Stapley?
It looks like that.
Stapley, did you say?
Stapley chart. It's called the Stapley
It's
chart.
empty in our attachment. I mean, there is no, it says Appendix H, but there's nothing in it.
All right, we'll have to make sure we get
Okay.
that in there then.
No, that's 203 or 203. But yeah,
And the way I characterize the plus and the minuses, and obviously NA stands for not applicable. The pluses is the likelihood of the ability to do it from the city. The minus is it's very difficult and has challenges, and difficult to ascertain whether that objective, strategy, or action is doable. So the more pluses you have as you go through those different categories, the more likelihood that you'll be able to achieve that objective and goal. And that takes into consideration funding, resources, and community support. So in the document, I'm going to start off the issue at hand. We have the study area, and this is about the 10-foot elevation line that we looked at and the cultural resources associated with that. So this establishes sort of what we're talking about as to where our priority and where our study areas of this cultural resource hazard mitigation plan would be. And part of that, we had done a cultural resource inventory. We're in the final stages of wrapping that up. But this inventory sort of did an evaluation. There's about 156 properties in this whole area. 140 of them are identified as having some historic value, but 104 of contributing. 104 of these are contributing buildings that they went through and did an intensive survey of their historic value and their vulnerability. And then the second, this is just going through the assessment and the worksheets. I'm just sort of outlining this inventory that they took a look at in terms of these buildings, right down to the context of significance of each and every one of these buildings. So the plan itself goes into a number of objective strategies and implementation actions. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them for you. I'm not going to get into every one of them, but I'm going to sort of highlight some of the strategies that I think are you should ascertain that you guys should be cognizant of and be aware of. Like I said, from your perspective, that chart, that Stapley chart, is sort of the things that will have impacts of what we've committed ourselves through this plan. So implement a public awareness and engagement program. This is talking about areas where we would research and communicate economic data and the impact of flood events and flood adaptation to the public and private property owners, businesses, and those and of the like. Develop a community engagement program to share practices with flood adaptation to not only just public but privately owned properties, and certainly USNA has been part of that. And provide information to business owners and resources available to support the business community, business continuity and disaster preparedness. This is working with the communities as things that they can do to protect themselves from a future flooding. The second area or objective is lead building resilient efforts in flood adaptation and mitigation. And this is to continue the Weather Together program as a resilience sort of office work plan. As you know, this has been a continuing effort. Started off with that landscape survey. There's been conferences, there's been charrettes, there's been a whole host of different activities engaging the community and informing the community, along with a website, to keep people engaged about flooding and the need to protect their resources in the plan. Develop and conduct required annual training for all city employees, department heads, I should say, focused on department heads and managers regarding flood adaptation and risk reduction. Community rating system, the National Flood Insurance Program, definitely a major part of activity that has been talked about with this council a lot of times, at developing a community rating system for flood insurance. You can obviously assist individuals with reduction in their flood insurance programs when you implement a community rating system. And a lot of that most of that is auditing and paperwork with EPA. Develop design guidelines and a how-to workbook. Sort of, create a strategy that gets people to understand and things that they can do themselves to protect themselves against flooding and preservation activities, their cultural resources. Again, trying to protect that cultural resource. Develop a disaster response and a recovery plan to build back better. This is focusing on objectives and strategies that say when something has been damaged, that we build it back and we protect it from future flooding. We talk about when something has been done and people have to go through the permitting process to develop sort of a process that is expedited review, look at the zoning procedures and the post-disaster recovery costs, because we know how simplified our process is. Come on, that's worth a joke. That's worth a laugh. And then, of course, training, disaster response technical assistance team. Create that with experience and specialization in historic properties, so that when they're looking at something and they're looking at a permit and we're protecting it from future for flood adaptation, but they protect the cultural resource at the same time. So we're looking at training the individuals. These are the actions and strategies that are identified in the plan. And of course, align land use, economic development, environmental and regulatory activities to protect the city's historic character and cultural and natural assets while promoting economic viability. That's a simple objective, no problems. This is looking at the design guidelines and incorporating adaptation techniques accepted by FEMA. It's certainly looking at updating our zoning ordinances and encouraging and incentivizing, if that's a word, hazard mitigation and flood adaptation techniques. And then, of course, identify our water priority, our water-dependent facilities, and prioritize them so they are well capable of dealing with nuisance flooding or storm surges and the like, and possibly protecting them for expansion of use, expanding their uses. Last but not least, fund public improvements and incentivize private investment in flood adaptation. This is extending the historic property tax credit to include qualifying flood adaptation projects for all properties in the historic district. Conduct feasibility studies on construction of natural barriers as well as permanent barriers. This is something that we've talked about, but this is all the study calls out for is looking at these. What are the things we've done? And we've come to you with the PALS project, University of Maryland, and the ideas of the students came up with ways you can adapt city dock from not just a natural barrier sort of philosophy, but also the permanent types of permanent barriers. And then also, obviously, planning for the 2050 sea level rise based on anticipated high tide of elevations. That's, again, we need to look. This picture is sort of illustrating the future flooding of the city based on projected tides on flooding. Last but not least, there is an implementation strategy that prioritizes. That the plan is set up in terms of projects, and I would characterize those projects as themes. And under those themes comes goals, objectives, and strategies. And city initiative, the top four you see up there are sort of the top high priority things that the plan calls for based on their process, the public engagement, the core groups of people that have been involved. They've identified those top four as the top priority projects, and those objectives underneath them that should be done as a high priority for the city. And I can go through some of the structural adaptation measures is the feasibility of elevating and redesigning the infrastructure. The city initiative for flood adaptation and risk management is sort of doing the training, the coordinating with city departments on flood risks and measuring the benefits. The flood preparedness and adaptation responses in city plans is integrating flood preparedness and responses in our plans, our codes, our policies, our design guidelines. And finally, sea level rise update to the city comprehensive plan is incorporating these policies and moving them forward in a more comprehensive approach from all aspects of city planning, not just as a hazard mitigation piece, but also part of your overall master planning efforts within the city. I know I talked fast. I went through a lot of information. Tom told me I had 8 minutes.
Alderman Savage? Thank you.
Thank you, Pete and Sally.
Sure.
Excellent report. See, I may be all questioned out after the last one, but
That was my plan.
I do have some comments. First of all, can you send this presentation
Absolutely.
to us?
Sure.
Because some of the things I don't recall seeing in here, at least organized like you had it. So who on your staff is going to do all this that you laid out?
Rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, you know, I heard you talk about the Office of Environmental Policy, had a long conversation, an impromptu conversation with Chief Simmons the other day. Spoke to the mayor. There's a number of ways in which this can be, we can attack this, but certainly Office of Environmental Policy would be involved, OEM would be involved, and planning would be involved. It's a coordinated effort, so.
Yeah, definitely. And I bring that up partly because for my colleagues' benefit. And I know at the last, or one of the recent finance committee meetings, they had the transition team from Money, I guess, come and report. And Dan Neese talked about the importance of resiliency. And he actually, and he's with the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center, he actually recommended a resiliency office. Mm-hmm. And in here, I think you called for resiliency officer, if I'm not mistaken.
We modified that because we called it a work program, a resiliency work, yeah. So.
But the bottom line is, I think, and point my colleagues out to something else on page 153. It's actually page 131 in the document, but you can go to the... That'll move you forward faster. So page 131, it shows actionable items. And then there are 38, I think. 48. 48. 131. And these are, I know you didn't talk about these, but I just want to emphasize because I thought they were really helpful. These are meant to be some of the more, let's see how you phrase it. Those could be implemented immediately or in the course of current city functions as listed here in no particular order. But they're meant to be kind of immediate action items. And again, just looking at the list of things, ideas here, and important things I think we need to do, again, for my colleagues' benefit, I think that's something we should talk about at some point about the Office of Environmental Policy and who's going to handle, what department's going to handle some of these resiliency obligations. As Dan Neese says, this is probably one of the most important decisions we will have to make as a council for, even though we won't realize the benefit as in our generation possibly, this is for future generations, but again, one of the most important things we can do for our city. And so I think we do need to figure out answer this question about who and how are we going to handle this resiliency. And to that end, I'd also like to urge you, I see you're going to have something in the comprehensive plan about sea level rise, but I think it's also would be good to call for a resiliency plan, just like I think you did for the city doc master plan, but just to call for some kind of document like that, which we can use. Because this, again, I want to point out for my colleagues that this study, as good as it is, it only focuses on downtown and for the most part, and we do have other city assets and resources and other parts of our community that will be impacted by sea level rise. So this is a large part of the overall puzzle and plan that we need to put together, in my
The actionable
opinion.
idea is just to clarify, not to take away from your other points, which are important, but just to clarify that is, these were a whole host of ideas that were collected from many different people, and they weren't all evaluated against the Stapley criteria. So it's, it ranges in scale and size of ideas, but
Okay.
they're just all collected in this place.
Yeah, thank you.
That's why I point to that chart. as
Alderman
something-
Tierney?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. I feel bad that feel like you're rushed, because a lot of work went into this and a lot of surveying, and I know that specifically in my ward, this is very personal and important. Could I ask you, where do you think we are with implementation, generally speaking?
Some of the things have been implemented. As you know, we had the Keeping History Above Water conference that was called out. We could continue and build on that. There has been a lot of public engagement and awareness through the Weather Together program, where we haven't done a lot at this point since historic preservation has been in unsettled territory right now. But moving forward, the Weather Together program, the ideas and public engagement and awareness continues to work. That effort will continue as soon as we work out some of the resources. Some of the stuff that Public Works is doing through AECom, those are the feasibility studies. Those are the analyses that they're talking about to dealing with stormwater management and flood adaptation down at City Dock with the pump. So there has been pieces and parts of it that they've recognized as part of this process, but are continuing to move forward. But there's still a lot more to do. And
So I'd like to offer,
Mr.
any help we can be in codifying some of this as far as, future building parameters at City Dock and raising foundation levels, et cetera.
Sure, and that's, as you know, we're looking at some of the City Dock zoning classifications, and this is part of that. We'll be thinking about the adaptation of buildings and the built environment through that textual amendments in the zoning code, so that'll all be part of it.
Okay, one last thing. You mentioned that this was an amendment to the hazard mitigation plan.
It's an addendum.
Addendum, what did
yeah.
I say? Addendum. And speaking of that, the way I understand it is Office of Emergency Management now has taken the lead, if you will, for lack of a better word, in implementing our stormwater management plan. Is that correct? And I see Kevin is here, and maybe can he explain how this, could he please explain how this is related to what you're doing? Because that's sort of the tangible effort right now. Thanks.
Deputy Fire Chief Kevin Simmons, Office of Emergency Management. This is, as I explained to the Finance Committee, we have to have hazardous mitigation plan to recoup funding from snowstorms, just any type of grants that we have. But it also projects what we're going to do into the future. And this is just an addendum to what we're doing. We don't necessarily have to have this, but this is great to have. And I think we're the first in the country to have a cultural hazardous mitigation plan with our hazardous mitigation.
So to answer your question, I think Kevin needs to be aware of all this, but I don't think this all falls in Mr. Chief Simmons' office. This is but he needs to be coordinated and aware of what we're doing.
But it helps us perhaps secure the necessary
And he's got all the money. so-
funding. Yeah. Okay.
Not all of the money, got some
Yeah.
of the money, trying to get more. But a lot of what we talked about today, what I've heard from the conversations today, is, they're talking about the Office of Environment, who's going to do what and what part. I don't think any one department can alone lead this, and I've been thinking about how this would work, and probably some type of work group with different segments of different departments, planning and zoning, the Office of Emergency Management, Environment, And one of the first things on the agenda should be the CRS, Community Rating System. We're behind on that. We should have done this a long time ago. The city manager recommended that we do this, and it kind of fell to the wayside. But if you can imagine, if we complete this and we do the audit, flood insurance for our citizens would go down a lot, like 20%, 25%. We just need to get a rating. That's easy to do, and we just need to do it. And it's other things that we need to achieve as well. Like the conversation was, sea level rise by 2050 is going to be 2 feet. 2 feet, and we need to start thinking about it. Governor O'Malley did a study about that. Maryland, as a government, is looking at it. We, as Annapolitans, need to look at it too, because, you know, we're up like 900% of floods from way back when.
Could I ask one last question? Who will spearhead the effort in protecting the historic properties, the historic structures? I know there's been a lot of work in how to do that, and when and how is that implemented?
Again, I think that's going to be a continued effort. I agree with Chief Simmons on that. It's a coordinated effort. It's not any one particular individual.
Sure.
But there has to be an individual involved that understands the preservation and the what needs to be protected, and those qualities of that cultural resource. That's why that cultural resource inventory needs to be. We're wrapping that up. And then the historic preservation person would be another coordinated effort as that process moves forward. I mean, you're definitely going to need that individual to be involved as part of that process, but it may be something else that you bring in as a strategy to fund it and or we talked about expanding the tax credits to give the person that ability to do that, but in the context of preserving that cultural resource.
So, in the hazardous mitigation plan, we've identified like 70 some odd sources. I even think it's more than 70 sources of grant funding that we can use for these various projects. And the issue is this stuff doesn't fit into one department really well. It doesn't fit into the Office of Emergency. You can't say Office of Emergency Management is the lead in this. You can't say Planning and Zoning. You can't say Public Works. And you can't say environment, but what we need to start thinking about, and we need to start thinking about the future, we need to start thinking about sea level rise, especially us. We're kind of the leaders because we get flooded out more than anybody, but we need to start looking at a working group that takes each part of Public Works, Planning and Zoning, OEM, and the environment and put that together, give them a focus, give them some goals and objectives, and then we just need to move forward.
To your point, which was really optimistic, is that the financial, as my colleague mentioned, the financial transition report, of all things, the financial transition report emphasized the necessity of having, a resiliency addressed in every department, and whether or not that requires a position or how we do that cross-pollination, I'm not sure, but it's something that, as you just said, it's not done by one department, and each department has to know what the other department is doing. And now that it's, in fairness, it's out of historic preservation, I would say, it has to be implemented by a multi-departmental effort. Good luck. No, I'm kidding.
I think it can be done. I mean, it's been done in other jurisdictions. From my perspective as Director of Planning and Zoning, I cut across a lot of different disciplines. Every day we're dealing with multiple agency reviews of any given project, so it's doable.
And you guys don't get off the hook either. We need champions for this. We need elected officials to be out in front with us as we do this sort of thing. And again, a good working group, I think we could head down that road and start looking at mitigation plans for the future for these issues.
This is the team here that's going to set the standard, right? Two quick questions. Alderman Arnett first.
So it's more of a summary comment, I believe, but it is directed at you, Mr. Mayor, because we had discussions with Chief Simmons yesterday in Finance, and we've had discussions all along about this. And this isn't just about the hazard mitigation for sea level rise. I think it encompasses current plans for things like nuisance flooding. And are we properly taking into account some sea level rise things that are going to be happening maybe sooner than we would like them to happen? And it is cross-cutting. It seems to me it's appropriate to be in the city manager's office, but probably not something we can expect the city manager to accomplish along with their other duties. So I'm hoping in your budget we'll see a reflection of a person or more that will help with this cross-cutting coordination.
Yes, what is it,
That
Alderman
was my
Savage?
question.
No, we have some ideas. Alderman Savage.
Yeah, thank you. And again, first of all, just thank you to all of you for your efforts in this area. And I also want to thank Lisa Craig, who's no longer with us in terms of working for the city. But she, I know, really just picked up the ball and ran with this when at a time when the city really needed to. And so thank you, Lisa, if you're listening. But and also I hear you, Chief, where it's hard to put this on one individual, but this does need to be a team effort. It definitely needs to be a team effort. And I think that the original intention of the Office of Environmental Policy and the reason why it's in the Office of the City Manager is to help provide that role. So I think that's a policy decision we need to figure out, and I think that department, we should look at revamping that, empowering that department to provide that role, keep it in the City Manager's office, and think about using that to help them coordinate the other department efforts in the city, and perhaps look at, again, positions with resiliency going forward. So, but thank you again.
So,
Thank you.
if I could make one last point. We have a lot of new and exciting plans for the dock. And I'm excited about some of the stuff that I hear, but we do have plans set up to deal with nuisance flooding. So as we move forward with concepts and plans, the Office of Emergency Management and other offices should know about that. So, because we may have to make some adjustments in our plans to mitigate nuisance flooding. Because we have a plan for the north side, we have a plan for the south side. And if we have plans to do things downtown, I think we should make it a vibrant place that everybody wants to go and be a part of. But however, as we make those plans, just kind of let us know and keep us in the loop, because we may have to alter the way we have plans set up to mitigate the nuisance flooding down there, the 40 or so times that we have it a year.
Thank you. Sure. Okay, thank you so much for the reports. We appreciate it. Thank you.
I was just going to mention next steps would be to move this forward through the adoption process. So we would start to introduce a resolution now that we have, I mean, if you have thoughts, comments, and ideas that we need to adjust to change the document, let us know. But the next steps would be to move this forward through council adoption, if it pleases the council.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sally. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Pete. Thank you. Okay, Mr. City Attorney, next item on the agenda.
The agenda has been completed, Mr. Mayor.
Is there anything else for good order? Hearing nothing. All right.
Second. Wait, for the good of the order, do you all know about Fred's grandson? Fred had a grandson.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, 3.5 weeks early.
Awesome.
Yeah, his daughter's doing well, and so is the grandfather, I think.
Great.
Yeah. 3.5 weeks early. Yeah, but it was still he didn't get, the weight was 5-something and 19 inches long. He was nervous because we had a housing meeting last night. He couldn't make it, and